Hey guys, tonight we are going on a little trip back in time. Not to a grand battle or a royal coronation, but to a dinner party. A very, very awkward dinner party in Renaissance Italy. We're going to explore how one of the simplest things on your table, the fork, was once a source of intense social anxiety, religious controversy, and a whole lot of side minus eye. Frankly, if you were dropped into one of these feasts with your modern manners, you probably wouldn't make it past the first course without offending someone powerful. You'd be the talk of Florence, and not in a good way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where everyone's listening from, so drop your city and the time right now in the comments below. It's like our own little global community, listening together in the quiet of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes. Imagine you're in a great hall in Florence. Sometime in the 15th century, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles, roasting meat, and expensive perfume doing its best to mask the smell of 100 warm bodies in a single room. The walls are covered in heavy, ornate tapestries that swallow the sound, creating a surprisingly intimate hum of conversation despite the grandeur. You're seated at a long, heavy wooden table, draped in a cloth of dazzling white linen. It's a sign of your host's immense wealth. You look down at your place setting. There's the crisp linen napkin, folded into an intricate shape. There's a gleaming personal knife, perhaps with an ivory or silver handle. There's a deep, beautiful spoon, likely made of pewter or silver, for any broths or soups that might appear. And that, you scan the table again, a faint sense of panic rising. There is no fork. Not for you. Not for the wealthy merchant to your left. Not for the lady in shimmering silk to your right. This is the world before the fork became common. A world where the primary tools for eating are the ones you were born with your fingers. Now, don't imagine a free minus for minus all, with people grabbing fistfuls of food. Oh no, this is an art. It's a delicate finger minus ballet, with a strict and unspoken choreography. You watch the others. The proper way to eat, you quickly learn, is to use only 3 fingers of your right hand, the thumb, the index, and the middle finger. To use all 5 is considered gluttonous and brutish. The mark of a peasant. You are to pick up morsels of food with just the very tips of these 3 fingers, a gesture of practiced intness. A massive platter is placed in the center of the table, piled high with slices of roasted capon, glistening with a sweet and sour sauce. This is a key detail. You don't have your own plate. You, and the guests seated immediately around you, all share from this central serving dish. Your challenge is to deftly, gracefully, lift a piece of meat from the communal platter and bring it to your mouth without dripping sauce on the pristine tablecloth, without letting your fingers get too messy, and certainly without touching anyone else's food. Your left hand, it stays in your lap, completely out of sight. The left hand was for baser, unclean tasks, and had no place at the dinner table. You try it. You carefully select a small piece, tenching it between your 3 fingertips. You lift it, pause for a moment to let any excess sauce drip back onto the platter, and then bring it to your mouth. Success. You feel a small sense of victory. Now, for the cleanup. You can't lick your fingers. That would be an unforgivable breach of decorum. Instead, you reach for that fancy napkin to gently dab your fingertips. Or, if you're at a particularly lavish feast, a servant might soon appear with an aquaman ile. This is one of those wonderfully strange little details of the past. It's a pitcher, often cast in bronze in the shape of a lion or a griffin, and the servant will pour a stream of warm, rose-scented water over your hands into a basin below. It's part minus hygiene, part minus performance art. The whole process is a constant, low-level source of anxiety. Each trip to the communal platter is a tiny social test, and this system, believe it or not, was considered the height of refinement. One of the period's most famous etiquette guides, the Galateo by Giovanni della Casa, spends a great deal of time on the proper, cleaned, and elegant use of one's hands at the table. To them, this was civilization. Of course, historians still debate how truly hygienic any of this was. On one hand, the constant washing and the very specific clean minus fingers technique suggest a genuine concern for cleanliness. On the other hand, you're still sharing a bowl with the person next to you, who may or may not have washed their hands as diligently after their last trip to the latrine. The historical consensus is that their idea of clean was simply different from ours, focused more on the visible and the aesthetic rather than the microscopic. So you eat your capon, hoping your neighbor is as well minus bread as he appears. The system worked. For them, it was a shared ritual that everyone understood. It wasn't broken, so why would anyone feel the need to fix it with some bizarre, spiking new invention? The stage is set not for a revolution, but for a very, very slow and awkward evolution. As you become more confident in the 3- fingered pinch, your attention drifts to the other tool at your disposal, that handsome little knife. It's your constant companion, your trusty sidekick in this culinary landscape. This isn't a knife provided by your host. Oh no, that would be like showing up to a party and expecting the host to provide you with a personality. You brought this knife yourself. Everyone did. Tucked into a sheath on your belt, it's as much a part of your daily dress as your shoes. You draw it now. Its weight familiar in your hand. Perhaps yours is a simple, functional piece with a smooth wooden handle. But as you glance around, you see that these knives are a quiet but clear broadcast of status. The merchant to your left has one with a handle of polished ivory, intricately carved with a scene from a hunt. The lady across from you, the one with the silk dress, has a knife whose handle is inlaid with shimmering mother of pearl. The truly powerful nobles at the head of the table might even have handles of silver, lapis lazuli, or rock crystal. Your knife is a personal statement, and in a room like this, every statement is being read. A new course arrives, carried in by a procession of servants. It's a whole roasted piglet, skin crackling ungolden, stuffed with herbs and fruits whose aroma now dominates the hall. It's placed on a huge silver platter in the middle of your section of the table. This is where your knife comes into its own. It is, first and foremost, a cutting tool. The highest ranking person near the platter takes their knife and carves off a few choice sections. Then, it's your turn. You reach forward, find a promising section, and firmly but elegantly slice off a manageable piece. There are no individual plates, remember? So your slice falls back onto the main platter, ready to be picked up. But your knife's job isn't done. All your fingers are perfect for small, dry morsels. What about that larger, slightly greasy piece of pork? You use the very tip of your knife. With a deft movement, you spear the piece of meat, lift it from the platter, and bring it to your mouth, eating directly from the point. This is the key function that makes the knife so indispensable. It cuts, and it spears. It's a 1 tool does minus all situation. But this spearing action comes with a minefield of etiquette rules. The number 1 rule, the one you absolutely cannot break, is that you must never make it look aggressive. The point of your knife should always be angled down towards the platter or up towards your own mouth. To gesture with it, or to point it across the table, would be the equivalent of shouting a threat. It's a tiny, stabby faux pas that everyone would notice. Some etiquette books of the time even suggested that a truly refined person would use their knife only to cut, and then use their fingers for the rest, as eating from a sharp point was considered a little too fierce. Here's a wonderfully niche detail because of this fear of aggression. Some of the most sophisticated hosts began to provide knives that had their tips intentionally blunted, rounded off so they couldn't be used for spearing at all. This was the ultimate flex of politeness. a way of saying, in my house, we are so civilized. We don't even need to point sharp things at our food. You also use your knife to serve others. If you carve a particularly good piece, you might offer it to your dining companion, using the tip of your knife to place it near them on the platter. It's a gesture of generosity and good breeding. The knife is a tool for sharing, for participating in the communal meal. The whole system is built on this shared understanding of a single, versatile tool. It feels natural, efficient in its own way, and because everyone brings their own, there's a sense of personal responsibility attached to it. Historians still debate the precise timeline of when the custom of bringing your own knife faded, giving way to the host providing a matched set for the whole table. This shift from personal equipment to a standardized, host-provided setting was a slow, creeping change that took centuries, and it represents a major psychological shift in how we view dining. But for now, in this hall, your knife is yours. It's a reflection of who you are, a tool you understand completely. It's reliable, it's traditional, it's certainly not some strange, newfangled contraption from a foreign land that looks like a miniature pitchfork. The knife is the king of the table, and kings don't usually give up their thrones without a fight. Just as you're feeling like a master of the knife minus finger technique. Let's rewind the clock. Before this grand Florentine party, before the Renaissance was even in full swing, the fork made its first, disastrous debut on the European stage. It wasn't a celebrated invention. It was an immigrant, a strange creature from all and that Western Europeans viewed with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion, the Byzantine Empire. So, travel with me now, further back, to Venice, around the year 1004. Venice, the gateway to the east, a city growing rich by trading with Constantinople. The son of the Doge, the leader of Venice, is marrying a noblewoman from the heart of the Byzantine court. Her name is Maria Argyropoulos. Picture her arrival. She comes from a city of unparalleled splendor, a place that still called itself the Roman Empire, a court where ceremony and luxury were polished to a high art over 1,000 years. To her, Venice, for all its rising wealth, must have seemed a bit rustic. The wedding feast is the talk of the town, and it is here, amidst the powerful and the pious of Venice, that the incident occurs. A course is served, perhaps preserved fruits in a thick, sticky syrup, a delicacy she brought with her. The Venetians around her prepare their fingers or the tips of their knives. But Maria does something else. A servant presents her with a small, velvet-lined case. She opens it. Inside, nestled in the fabric, are tiny, sprung implements made of pure gold. You have to imagine the silence that falls over her part of the table. What is that thing? It's not a knife. It's not a spoon. It's this little golden monster. The spiky, bizarre object. She picks one up. It looks delicate, but also vaguely menacing. She then uses this tool to spare a piece of candied quince, lifting it to her mouth without her fingers ever touching the sticky syrup. She eats it neatly, gracefully, in a way that is utterly alien to everyone watching. The reaction is not one of admiration. It's one of quiet, scandalized confusion. The whispers would have started almost immediately. Why is she doing that? Is there something wrong with her hands? Does she think she's too good to touch the food God has provided? It's seen not as refinement, but as an act of breathtaking arrogance. To refuse to touch your food was to create a barrier between yourself and God's bounty, and to create a barrier between yourself and your fellow diners. It was an act of profound, almost offensive, otherness. This moment is captured for us by a man named Peter Damian, a rather stern cardinal who wrote about it a few decades later. And here we hit our first major historians are still arguing point. Peter Damian was a religious reformer, a fire minus brimstone type who despised luxury and what he saw as moral decay. He tells the story of Maria and her golden forks with undisguised contempt. He describes her fastidious, decadent lifestyle, and then gleefully reports that she and her husband both died from the plague a few years later. To him, the conclusion was obvious: it was divine punishment. God had struck her down for her sinful pride and her unnatural, for unhabits personified by that cursed fork. So, historians today are in a lively debate. Did the wedding guests really see the fork as a tool of the devil in that moment? Or was it just seen as a weird, quirky, slightly snobbish habit of a foreign princess? It's entirely possible that Peter Damien, writing with a clear moral agenda, took a minor social oddity and blew it up into a full blown tale of sin and retribution to scare his followers into a more austere lifestyle. We'll likely never know the precise atmosphere in the room that day, but what we do know is that Damien's account became the dominant narrative. He successfully branded the fork. For centuries after Mary Zelmina's fated dinner, the fork was associated with her story. It was foreign, it was decadent, it was effeminate, and, worst of all, it was an affront to God. It was a little monster from Byzantium, a symbol of pride that led to a terrible end. The fork's first audition in Western Europe was a spectacular failure. It wasn't just rejected, it was demonized. The little tool was so thoroughly shamed that it would have to wait in the wings for hundreds of years before it dared to make another appearance at the dinner table. The ground was not yet fertile for such a strange seed. The culture first had to change in a fundamental way, but the memory of that golden, two-pronged creature lingered. A cautionary tale whispered among the European nobility. The story of the Byzantine princess and her divine punishment was a powerful one, and it taps into a much deeper, more visceral objection to the fork that resonated throughout medieval Europe. This wasn't just about table manners. It was about theology. For many devout Christians, the fork was just foreign and decadent. It was a tool of the devil himself. Let's try to get inside this mindset. Look at the fork. The early ones, like the ones Maria used, were small and had only 2 sharp tines, or prongs. Now, picture the most common artistic depiction of Satan in the Middle Ages. He is often shown wielding a large, 3-pronged pitchfork, a tool used to torment the souls of the damned in the fires of hell. To the medieval mind, accustomed to thinking in symbols and allegories, the resemblance was uncanny and deeply unsettling. This new dining implement looked like a miniature version of the devil's own weapon. You're sitting at a table, about to partake in a meal. A meal is a gift from God. The act of eating is a communion, a way of receiving God's bounty and giving thanks for it. The proper way to do this is with the tools God gave you, your fingers. They are natural, human, and divinely designed to introduce this little metal pitchfork into the sacred ritual of the meal felt, to some, like inviting evil to the table. It was a conscious rejection of the natural order. One clergyman famously railed against it, calling it an insult to God, who gave us fingers as natural forks. Why would a good Christian use an artificial fork when a natural one was readily available? This theological argument carried immense weight. The Church was the central authority on morality, and its pronouncements shaped every aspect of daily life, from marriage to mealtimes. The association of the fork with diabolical imagery was a powerful public relations problem for the fledgling utensil. It wasn't just seen as effeminate or weird, it was seen as impious, a small act of rebellion against the divine plan. Imagine a priest giving a sermon in a cold stone church, his voice echoing in the nave. He might speak of the virtues of humility and simplicity. He might warn his flock against the sin of superb, by ape pride, the very sin that lead to Lucifer's fall from heaven. And then he might point to the new, luxurious habits creeping in from the east, like the use of these strange, pointy implements at the dinner table. Are your fingers, made in the image of God, not good enough for you? He might thunder. Must you eat with a miniature devil's trident? For the average person in the pews, that was a pretty compelling argument. No one wanted to risk their immortal soul over a table utensil. Now, here's a fascinating little side note, a piece of trivia that shows how deep this symbolic thinking went. The very word fork in some languages has slightly sinister roots. It comes from the Latin furca, which originally meant a pitchfork, but was also the name of a V-shaped wooden yoke used to punish criminals and slaves. So, the name itself carried connotations of punishment, torment, and low status. It wasn't exactly a word that screamed elegance and refinement. This religious and symbolic opposition created a powerful cultural barrier. For centuries, the fork remained a curiosity, confined to the most lavish, and perhaps most daring, courts in Italy that had extensive contact with the Byzantine world. Even there, it was used sparingly. It was primarily a sweetmeat fork, used only for eating sticky preserved fruits or candies at the very end of a meal, things that would be particularly messy to handle with fingers. It was a niche tool for a niche food, not a replacement for the knife and fingers. Historians are still debating how much of this anti-fork sentiment was genuine, widespread theological belief versus how much was just a convenient excuse used by traditionalists to resist a foreign cultural import. Was the average person really terrified of the fork's satanic resemblance? Or was it more of a cultural shorthand, an easy way to label something as not one of us? It was likely a mix of both. The symbolism was real and potent, but it also served to reinforce the general cultural conservatism. The result was that the fork was stuck. It couldn't gain widespread acceptance as long as it was seen as a tool of sin. For the fork to truly find its place at the European table, society itself had to change. The focus had to shift away from the purely symbolic and theological, towards a new set of values. A new obsession would be needed to overpower the old one, and that new obsession was just around the corner, waiting to be born in the bustling city-states of Italy. The fork's dark age was coming to an end, but its next chapter would be just as fraught with anxiety, albeit of a more secular kind. Let's jump forward in time again. Leave the dark, echoing churches of the Middle Ages behind. You are now stepping into the bright, crackling energy of Renaissance Italy. The air here feels different. It's vibrant, competitive, and humming with a new kind of energy. You're in Florence, or perhaps Venice or Milan, in the late 15th or early 16th century. The world is changing at a dizzying pace. This isn't just a renaissance of art and philosophy. It's a renaissance of everything, including self-consciousness. Suddenly, how you do things becomes just as important as what you do. A new ideal is taking hold among the wealthy merchant class and the nobility, the concept of sbrsura. This wonderful Italian word, popularized by Baldassare Castiglione in his hugely influential book, The Book of the Cordia, is tricky to translate. It means a kind of studied nonchalance, the art of making the difficult look effortless. It's about displaying grace, wit, and refinement in everything you do, from composing a sonnet to riding a horse to, yes, even eating your dinner. You feel this new pressure everywhere. The goal is no longer just to be pious and powerful. The goal is to be civilized. The word they used was, it's a competitive, performative kind of politeness. You are constantly on display, and your every action is being judged by your peers. Are you clumsy? Are you coarse? Do you behave like a country bumpkin or a sophisticated urbanite? The stakes feel incredibly high, because in this fluid new social world, demonstrating your refinement is a way to assert and defend your status. Walk through the streets of Florence, the new Palazzo S being built by the Medici, the Trauzi, and the Pitti families are monuments to this new ideal. They are elegant, symmetrical, and based on classical Roman principles. They reject the barbaric and messy Gothic style of the past. This obsession with clean lines, order, and elegance in architecture is a perfect mirror for the new obsession with clean lines, order, and elegance in personal behavior. Now, come back to the dinner party. The setting is even more lavish than before. The tablecloth is even wider. The conversations are quieter, more witty, and the old way of eating, the communal, hands minus on free minus for minus all, suddenly starts to seem a little messy, a little crude, a little bit medieval. The problem is one of aesthetics. When you're all striving for as hard as it you are for that air of effortless grace, plunging your fingers into a shared bowl of stew seems distinctly ungraceful. Getting grease on your expensive velvet sleeve is a disaster. Dripping sauce on that pristine white tablecloth is a mark of clumsiness. The old ways, which for centuries felt perfectly normal and civilized, are now being viewed through this new lens of hyper-minus refinement. And they're coming up short. This is the cultural soil in which the fork can finally begin to grow. The old religious objections haven't vanished entirely. You'll still hear a conservative old uncle grumble about unnatural tools, but they are being drowned out by a new, more pressing anxiety, the fear of social embarrassment. The fear of being seen as uncivilized is starting to outweigh the fear of using a tool that vaguely resembles a devil's pitchfork. A key figure in this shift is, ironically, the same man who wrote so much about elegant finger minus usage, Giovanni della Casa. In his etiquette book The Galateo, he spends a lot of time telling you what not to do. Don't scratch yourself at the table. Don't spit. Don't clean your teeth with your napkin. And, crucially, don't be a messy eater. He complains about people who soil their fingers so deep in the soup that they can't even pick up a piece of bread without befouling it. He is articulating this new sensitivity, this new ICK factor. Historians still argue about whether this new desire for refinement was a top-down phenomenon, dictated by tastemakers like Castiglione della Casa, or a bottom-up one, driven by the social climbing anxieties of the newly rich merchant class trying to imitate the old aristocracy. The most likely answer is that it was a feedback loop. The writers articulated the ideals, and the people, in their quest for status, tried to live up to them, which in turn created a bigger market for books on how to be more refined. So the stage is set. You have a society obsessed with elegance, cleanliness, and individual performance. You have a dining culture that, by these new standards, is starting to look unpleasantly messy. All you need is a catalyst, a specific problem that the old ways just can't solve. The fork is no longer a villain or a weirdo. It's now a potential solution, waiting for its moment to prove its worth. It's a tool perfectly suited for this new age of anxiety. Its time is coming, not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate need to eat a piece of sticky fruit without looking like a slob. Renaissance Italy has gone wild for sugar. It's pouring into venison Genoa from the east, a luxury good that is rapidly becoming a status symbol. The wealthier you are, the more sugar you can afford to flaunt. And the Italian chefs, being the brilliant artists they are inventing ever more elaborate and structurally challenging ways to use it. Picture the end of the feast. The savory courses are cleared away, and the servants bring in the triumphant autovola, the triumphs of the table. These are massive, edible sculptures made of spun sugar, marzipan, and pastry. You might see a perfect replica of a castle, a mythological scene, or a menagerie of fantastical beasts. But this is just the centerpiece. The real challenge comes with what you're actually meant to eat. A platter is placed before you, laden with the era's most fashionable desserts. There are fruits preserved in thick, heavy honey or sugar syrup, glistening like jewels. There are small tarts filled with a dense, sticky mixture of ground almonds, sugar, and rosewater. There's a new confection that's all the rage pasta, but not the savory pasta we know today. This is dessert pasta, boiled until soft and then drenched in sweet sauces, sprinkled with sugar and cinnamon. Now, try to eat this with your fingers. You reach for a piece of candied pear. The moment you touch it, your 3 dainty fingertips are coated in a thick, tacky syrup that seems to have a mind of its own. You bring it to your mouth. A thin, sugary thread connects the pear to the platter, and you have to do a weird little twirl to break it. A drop of syrup lands precariously close to your cuff. You pop the pear in your mouth, delicious, But now your fingers are a complete mess. You can't just wipe them on your napkin. You create a sticky, ugly smear. You need that servant with the ewer of scented water. But he can't be at your elbow every 2 seconds. You look at the sweet pasta. How in God's name are you supposed to eat that with your fingers? Do you just scoop it up? The very thought is horrificously uncivilized. Your other tool, the knife, is no help here. You can't spare a slippery, syrupy noodle. You can't gracefully cut a sticky tart without getting the filling all over the blade. The old system, the one that works so perfectly for roasted meats and pieces of bread, is utterly failing in the face of this new, sugary onslaught. This is the fork's moment to shine. Somewhere down the table, a particularly fashion-forward guest does something daring. They produce a small, pronged fork. It might be silver, or even rock crystal. They calmly spear a piece of that sticky pear. They lift it. No drips, no sticky fingers. They place it in their mouth. It's clean, it's elegant, it's controlled. It is the very picture of SPR as at URA. Suddenly, the fork doesn't look like a devil's pitchfork. It looks like a solution. It's a specialized tool for a specialized problem. This is how the fork gets its foot in the door of mainstream Italian society, not as an all-purpose eating utensil, but as a sweetmeat fork, a fourchetted ad olsi. It's a dessert accessory. One of the most fascinating tidbits from this period comes from inventories of noble households. When forks first start appearing in these household accounts, they are oft unlisted not with the other cutlery in the pantry, but in the lady of the house's private chambers, stored in elaborate cases alongside her jewels and perfumes. This tells us a lot about how they were perceived. They were personal, precious, and associated with the most refined and delicate part of the meal. They were a lady's accessory, used for the cleanest and most elegant of foods. Historians still debate the exact role pasta played in this story. Some argue that the rise of syrupy dessert pasta was the killer app for the fork, the one food that made it indispensable. Others believe the sticky preserved fruits were the more significant driver. The reality is likely that it was the combination of all these new, messy, high-status sweet foods that created the perfect storm. The desire to eat them, combined with the desire to do so elegantly, made the fork seem not just acceptable, but necessary. So you sit there with your sticky fingers, watching your fashionable neighbor eat with their elegant little fork. The message is clear. To be truly modern, truly refined, you need one of these. The fork has successfully rebranded itself. It's no longer a symbol of foreign decadence or satanic pride. It's a symbol of cleanliness, sophistication, and being in no. It has become a tool for navigating the sticky, treacherous, and delicious world of the Renaissance dessert course. The rest of the meal may still belong to the fingers and the knife, but the final act now belongs to the fork. And once you let a tool onto the table for one course, it's only a matter of time before it starts sawing the others. The sweetmeat fork has made its debut, a chic accessory for the dessert course, but the transition from a niche, specialist tool to an all-purpose utensil is a long and socially treacherous road. Someone has to be the first to break ranks. Someone has to be the first person to pick up that fork and use it for the main course, for the meat, the vegetables, the entire meal. Imagine you are that person. You're a young, ambitious man or woman at a banquet in Milan or Rome. You've seen forks used for candied fruit, and you own a rather handsome silver one yourself. Tonight, you've decided you're going to make a statement. You're going to use your fork for everything. It's a calculated risk. On the one hand, you might be seen as a trendsetter, the very embodiment of modern refinement. On the other hand, you could be seen as pretentious, affected, and deeply weird. The first course arrives. It's a platter of roasted quail. The others at your table draw their knives and prepare their 3-fingered pinch. They carve. They spear with their knife tips. They eat. It's the familiar, centuries-old rhythm of the feast. Then, you make your move. You hold your knife in your right hand, as is proper, but instead of leaving your left hand in your lap, you bring it up to the table, and in it, you hold your fork. You use the knife to cut a piece of quail. Then, instead of picking it up with your fingers, or the tip of your knife, you pin it to the platter with your fork, ensuring it doesn't move as you cut. Clean, precise. Then, you lay down your knife, switch the fork to your right hand, spear the piece of meat, and lift it to your mouth. A hush doesn't fall over the room. There is no dramatic music, but people notice. You can feel their eyes on you. The older man to your right, a traditionalist, gives a barely perceptible shake of his head. He sees your actions as unnecessarily complicated, a fussy and deforminate display. Why use two tools when one or your god-given fingers will do? He mutters something under his breath about young people and their ridiculous affectations. The young woman across from you, however, watches with keen interest. She is intrigued. She sees the logic. Your hands stay cleaner. Your sleeve is in no danger. There is a certain deliberate elegance to your movements. You are not just eating. You are performing a miniature, civilized ballet. You are demonstrating your mastery over not just the food, but over a new and complex system of etiquette. You are signaling that you belong to the future, not the past. This is the central tension. Using a fork for the whole meal is an act of social bravado. It's a gamble, and for a long time, the traditionalists hold the upper hand. Writings from the period are full of mockery for the fork-men. They are described as finicky, overly delicate, and unmanly. There's a persistent idea that there's something slightly deceitful about it, as if you're hiding your true, baser nature behind a facade of metallic refinement. One of the most charmingly specific criticisms you might face is that of noise. If you're not careful, the tines of your metal fork will scrape loudly against the earthenware or pewter platter. This sound, to Renaissanceers, is the sonic equivalent of nails on a calcboard. It's grating, uncivilized, and a clear sign that you are an amateur at this new game. A true master of the fork would perform the action silently, with a practiced, light touch. Historians are still trying to pinpoint exactly who these early adopters were. Were they the nobility, trying to further distinguish themselves from the merchant class? Or were they the nouveau rich, the wealthy bankers and traders who seized upon the fork as a way to quickly acquire a veneer of sophistication that their old money rivals already possessed? There's evidence for both sides. Some of the most elaborate and expensive early forks belonged to established ducal families. But the sheer volume of satirical commentary aimed at social climbers using forks suggests it was a powerful tool for those on the way up. So you continue your meal, acutely aware of the scrutiny. Every movement is deliberate. You use your fork to gently move some cooked greens onto your bread, trencher a slice of stale bread that acts as a plate. You use it to study a piece of cheese while you slice it. You are, in essence, discovering a new culinary grammar. And like anyone learning a new language, your first attempts are probably a bit clumsy, a bit stilted. You are living through a moment of profound behavioral change, and you are on the cutting edge of it. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward, but with every successful, clean, and elegant bite you take, you are making a case for this new technology. You are the walking, eating advertisement for the fork. The people watching you will go home and think about it. The young woman who was intrigued might task her father to procure a set of forks for their household. The old man who scoffed will die out, and his opinion with him. This is how change happens, not in a sudden revolution, but one awkward dinner party at a time, led by a few brave or perhaps just pretentious souls willing to risk ridicule for the sake of refinement. So you've taken the plunge. You are now a fork-minus user, a pioneer on the front lines of culinary fashion. You hold the implement in your hand, feeling its weight. But let's be very clear, this is not the friendly, familiar fork from your modern kitchen drawer. This is its ancestor, and it is a brutish, awkward thing. It's most likely made of silver or iron, and it consists of a straight handle leading to two and only two long, straight, and alarmingly sharp tines. There is no gentle curve to the tines, no comforting scoop minus shape to the head. It is essentially a miniature bit end, a tiny spear. It doesn't look like something designed for comfort or ease. It looks like a tool, or perhaps a weapon scaled down for a dollhouse. Using it is not intuitive. It requires a whole new set of physical skills, a manual you have to learn on the fly while trying to look effortlessly graceful. Welcome to your first lesson, the stabbing pin. This is the fork's primary, and frankly, only truly effective function. A servant places a slice of roasted venison in front of you, with your knife in your right hand and this new implement in your left. You press the two sharp tines firmly into the meat, pinning it to the trencher or platter. Now it can't slide around. You can cut a neat, perfectly sized bite with your knife. It's a small but significant victory for control and precision. Now for part 2 of the maneuver. You have a few choices, each with its own social risks. You could follow the emerging modern style, lay down your knife, switch the fork to your right hand, spear the morsel you just cut, and lift it to your mouth. This is seen as the most elegant method, but it's slow and requires a lot of switching. Or you could keep the fork in your left hand and lift the meat directly, a style that would eventually become the European standard, but at this stage might still be seen as slightly impatient. What you must not do is look like you're actually stabbing your food with aggression. The movement must be firm but delicate. The press, not a jab. Listen to the inevitable failure. Your host, with a hint of passive aggression, now serves a side dish of tender, stewed chickpeas, or perhaps an early version of polenta. You look at the soft, scoop-able food. You look at your tiny spear. A sense of dread washes over you. You try to use the fork. You try to spare a few chickpeas. They either break apart or refuse to be impaled. You try to balance them on the two thin tines. They wobble precariously and then fall off, rolling mockingly across your plate. You try to gather some of the soft polenta. It just squishes through the tines. This is the fork's great design flaw. It can pierce, but it cannot scoop or hold for any food that isn't a solid, cut table chunk. The fork is utterly, comically useless. You watch in quiet humiliation as the traditionalists around you elegantly use their spoons, or even a piece of bread, to convey the soft food to their mouths. You, the sophisticated fork-minus user, are reduced to chasing your food around the plate. Here we find a wonderfully specific piece of forgotten etiquette. In your desperation, you might be tempted to turn the fork sideways and use it as a kind of tiny, inefficient shovel to push the food towards your mouth. According to the early etiquette writers, this was a cardinal sin. It was considered laughably crude, the mark of someone who had no idea what they were doing. It was like trying to write a sonnet with a hammer. The fork was for spearing, and if your food couldn't be speared, then you were supposed to use a different tool. This rigid adherence to function over convenience is a hallmark of the era. Why did this clumsy, two-minus-sprung design persist for so long? This is a subject of great debate among food historians. Was it a technological problem? Perhaps the metallurgy of the time made it difficult to forge a strong, curved head with multiple, delicate tines. Or was it, as some argue, a failure of imagination? For centuries, the mental model for the fork was the spear. It was a piercing tool. The idea of it being a carrying or scooping tool hadn't fully formed yet. They weren't trying to build a better spoon. They were trying to build a more polite knife minus point. They were stuck on the idea of the stab, so the design reflected that, even with all its obvious flaws. You finish the course, having successfully eaten the venison and more or less given up on the chickpeas. You are keenly aware that this new elegance is hard work. The fork is not a user-minus-friendly device. It's a high-minus-maintenance, demanding companion that solves one problem sticky fingers while creating a dozen new ones. It's the beta version of a technology, full of bugs and awkward workarounds, and as you set it down, waiting for the next culinary challenge, You can't help but wonder if there isn't, perhaps, a better way to build this thing. As you wrestle with your 2- Brong Shong Shong Qi, a wonderful descriptor, you become aware of another, more subtle layer of conversation happening around you. It's a debate not about practicality, but about identity. The fork isn't just a tool, it's a symbol. And one of the most heated arguments it has ignited is about gender. Specifically, is using a fork manly? To the older generation, the men who grew up with the knife minus finger method, the answer is a resounding no. To them, manlines is tied to a certain directness, a lack of fuss. Damon eats heartily. He is not afraid to get his hands dirty, within the bounds of decorum. Of course, the knife is a masculine tool. It's descended from the hunting dagger, the soldier's sidearm. It has a noble, martial heritage. You use it to carve the beast, to assert your presence at the table. It is strong, simple, and effective. Then there's the fork. It's small, it's delicate. It encourages small, neat bites rather than hearty mouthfuss. Its use is associated with the dessert course, with sweet, frivolous foods. Its early adoption, as we saw, was often led by noble women in their private chambers. In the collective imagination, the fork is becoming coded as feminine. A popular trope in the comedies and satirical writings of the time is the fop, the overly fashionable man who is adopted foreign customs. He speaks in an affected accent, wears ridiculously flamboyant clothes, and, of course, eats with a fork. He is presented as a laughable figure, a man who has sacrificed his natural Italian virility for a veneer of trendy, but ultimately weak, sophistication. The fork is a prop, a shorthand for his effeminacy. One English traveler, Thomas Goriat, who tried to introduce the fork to England after his travels in Italy, was mercilessly mocked for it and given the nickname first CIFer, which literally meant fork minus bearer, but was also a Latin pun on rascal or scoundrel. The implication was clear: real men don't use forks. Imagine a conversation at the dinner table. An old baron, watching you meticulously cut and lift a piece of meat with your fork, might laugh and say something like, "My boy, you handle that fork like a Venetian courtesan handles a lute. Why not use the tools God gave you? Are you afraid of the food?" The comment gets a chuckle from the other traditionalists. It's a social pressure tactic, designed to gently or not so gently mock you back into the fold of conventional masculinity. Your response is critical. You can't get angry. That would be a loss of SPR as it you are a. You must reply with a cool, witty remark. Perhaps you say, "My lord, I am simply ensuring that my hands remain as ready to wield a sword for Florence as they are to enjoy your magnificent feast." You are trying to frame the fork, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a symbol of a new kind of masculinity, one based on control, refinement, and intellect rather than brute force. This is a profound cultural shift. The Renaissance is redefining what it means to be an ideal man. The brutish medieval knight is being replaced by the ideal of the Renaissance man, the courtier who can fight, but can also write poetry, speak 3 languages, and debate philosophy. In this new context, a man who demonstrates refinement at the dinner table is not necessarily weak. He is showcasing his civility, his self-control, his mastery of the social graces. The fork becomes a tool for this new performance of manhood. Historians are still debating how deep this gendered minus utensil anxiety really ran. Was it a genuine cultural crisis? Or was it more like a playful, recurring joke, similar to how people today might mock someone for ordering a ridiculously complicated coffee? The sheer volume of commentary suggests it was a real and persistent source of tension. The fork was genuinely seen as a threat to traditional gender roles. Its adoption forced a renegotiation of what constituted manly behavior at the table. Interestingly, this debate had a flip side. For women of the court, the fork was an unmitigated good. It allowed them to eat with greater dignity and cleanliness, reinforcing the era's ideals of feminine grace and purity. A woman who mastered the fork was seen as exquisitely well bred. It was a tool that perfectly aligned with and enhanced the expectations of femininity, while simultaneously challenging the expectations of masculinity. So use it there, the young man with your fork, caught in the crossfire of a cultural debate. Your simple choice of utensil has made you a participant in a much larger conversation about what it means to be a man in this new, rapidly changing world. Each bite you take is a quiet argument, a vote cast in favor of a new definition of masculine grace. It's a lot of pressure for a piece of quail. You've decided to brave the social critique. You've committed to the fork, navigating its clumsy design and its gendered implications. Just when you think you've got the hang of it, you stumble into the next great etiquette minefield. A question so vexing that it would divide diners for the next 2 centuries. Which hand do you use? The old way was simple. Your right hand was for eating. It held the knife. It wielded the spoon. It deployed the 3-fingered pinch. Your left hand was the unclean hand, reserved for less savory tasks, and it stayed firmly off the table, preferably in your lap. It was a straightforward, universally understood rule. The fork shatters this simplicity. You now have 2 primary tools, your knife and your fork, and you only have 2 hands. This creates a logistical and philosophical problem. You watch the other fork-minus users at the table, trying to discreetly figure out the correct way. You notice they are not all doing the same thing. A small but fierce battle of techniques is playing out in miniature all along the banquet table. Let's call the first technique the switch. This is the one you tried earlier. You hold your fork in your left hand and your knife in your right. You use the fork to pin down a piece of meat. You use your knife to cut it. Then, you place your knife down on the edge of your platter. You switch your fork from your left hand to your right hand. You then use your right hand to lift the morsel to your mouth. After the bite, you switch the fork back to your left hand, pick up your knife again, and prepare for the next cut. This method has its champions. They argue it's the most refined and logical approach. Why? Because the right hand has always been the hand for bringing food to the mouth. The switch respects this ancient tradition. It uses the left-handed fork merely as a helpful, but subordinate, assistant for the cutting process. The final, crucial act of eating is still performed by the dominant, clean right hand. It's a conservative, hybrid approach, but my God, it's inefficient. It involves a constant, fussy clatter of placing and retrieving your knife, a series of movements that can easily look clumsy if not executed with perfect chess PR as at URA. Then you notice another group practicing the Euro. This is a more radical, streamlined approach. Again, you hold the fork in your left hand and the knife in your right. You pin the meat with the fork, cut with the knife. But here's the revolutionary part: you don't switch. You simply keep the fork in your left hand, spare the piece of meat you just cut, and lift it directly to your mouth with your left hand. The knife stays in your right hand, resting on the plate, ready for the next cut. This is faster. It's more efficient. To a modern eye, it's completely normal. But in Renaissance Italy, this is a scandalous breach of protocol. You are putting food into your mouth with your left hand, the hand that was, for centuries, banished from the table as unclean. To the traditionalists, this is the ultimate sign of barbarism disguised as progress. It's one thing to use a weird new tool, but to use it with the wrong hand? That's a step too far. Champions of the Euro would argue that the fork acts as a barrier. Your unclean hand isn't touching the food. The clean metal fork is. The tool sanctifies the action. This argument, as you can imagine, does not convince everyone. Here we encounter a fantastic, and still debated, piece of historical trivia. Why did America, centuries later, end up adopting the switch now often called the American or zig-minus-ag method, while Europe adopted the more efficient left-minus-handed fork method? The prevailing theory is that when the fork crossed the Atlantic, it was at a time when the switch was still considered the height of fashion and politeness in England and France. America adopted this formal, elaborate technique and, in its own particular way, codified it and stuck with it. Europe, meanwhile, continued to evolve, eventually favoring the more practical left-handed approach. It's a fascinating case of a cultural habit being frozen in time after being exported. Say you're left with a choice. Do you align with the switchers, who value tradition and right-handed purity, but risk looking fussy? Or do you join the Euros, who value efficiency but risk looking like uncivilized left-handed heathens? Your choice signals your allegiance in this micro-war of manners. It says something about your attitude towards tradition and change. For now, as a novice, you probably opt for the safer, more conservative switch. It's more work, but it offends fewer people. You painstakingly cut, lay down the knife, switch hands, beat, switch back, pick up the knife. It feels absurd, a ritual designed by a madman. But this is the price of politeness in an age of transition. The fork was supposed to make eating cleaner and more elegant, but in its early days, it often just made it more complicated. You're deep in concentration, trying to master the complex choreography of the switch, your brow furrowed with the effort of not looking like you're trying so hard. You successfully pin a piece of chicken, cut a neat bite, place your knife down, switch the fork to your right hand, and then it happens. As you spear the morsel, the metal tines of your fork scrape against the glazed surface of the ceramic platter. The sound is sharp, high-pitched, and cuts through the low hum of conversation like a shriek. The people nearest to you visibly flinch. The host, the man who prides himself on the refined atmosphere of his gatherings, shoots you a look of pure, undiluted pain. You have just committed one of the gravest sins of the Renaissance stable. You have created noise pollution. In our modern world, filled with the constant drone of traffic, notifications, and background music, we are largely desensitized to noise. But in the 16th century, a world without engines or electricity, unwanted sound was a much more potent intrusion. The ideal social environment, especially an elite one like this banquet, was one of controlled, harmonious sound, the murmur of witty conversation, the gentle strains of a lute playing in the corner, the soft rustle of silk. A sudden, sharp, ugly noise was an act of violence against this carefully constructed soundscape, and the screech of metal on ceramic was considered the absolute worst. It was the sound of clumsiness, the sound of carelessness. It was, in a word, ugly, and in a culture obsessed with beauty and grace, ugliness was a social crime. The early etiquette books are surprisingly vocal about this. They instruct the reader to handle their utensils with a light and delicate touch, to place them down on the table without any sound, and to avoid at all costs the dreaded scrape. Why was this such a big deal? It goes back to the core concept of SPRSITURA. The whole point is to make difficult things look effortless. A loud scrape is audible proof that you are, in fact, struggling. It's a confession of your incompetence. It shatters the illusion of grace you are so desperately trying to build. The perfect fork minus user is a silent fork minus user. Their movements are so fluid and precise that the utensil seems to be an extension of their own hand, gliding through the meal without a single grating sound. This acoustic anxiety reveals a fascinating detail about the material culture of the time. The platters and plates were often made of tin-glazed earthenware, known as majolica, or sometimes pewter. While beautiful, these surfaces were relatively soft. A careless user with a sharp iron fork could not only create a horrible noise, but could also physically scratch and damage the host's expensive serving ware. So, your noisy scrape isn't just an assault on the ears, it's a physical assault on your host's property. You might as well have taken your knife and carved your initials into his dining table. This leads to a kind of arms race of refinement. To avoid the scrape, diners have to develop an incredibly light touch, but hosts also play their part. The wealthiest households begin to favor serving platters made of silver. Silver is softer than iron and less likely to produce that high pitched shriek when it meets a fork. Serving your meal on a full set of silver platters is a massive status symbol, not just because of the cost of the metal, but because it's a subtle flex that says, "My house is so refined." We have even engineered the ugliness of scraping out of our meals. Historians who study the sensory experiences of the past, a field sometimes called sensory history, are deeply interested in moments like this. They debate how to interpret these written condemnations of noise. Was the sound objectively more offensive to their ears, which were accustomed to a quieter world, or was the objection purely a matter of social convention, a sound that was designated as bad because it was associated with low-minus class, clumsy behavior? The answer is likely a complex interplay of both. The sound was inherently jarring, and that jarring quality was then mapped onto a social hierarchy. So use it there, your face burning with shame. The quail morsel on your fork suddenly feels like the heaviest thing in the world. You want to disappear. You have failed the test of silence. You have announced to the entire table that you are still a clumsy amateur in this new, demanding world of fork etiquette. Your only hope is to recover your composure, to complete the bite with as much grace as you can still muster, and to spend the rest of the meal moving with the exaggerated, silent care of a bomb disposal expert. The experience is a powerful lesson at the Renaissance table. Elegance is not just about how you look, but also about how you sound, or rather, how you don't. The fork, for all its awkwardness and controversy, is slowly but surely conquering the dinner tables of Italy. It has become a marker of sophistication, a must-have for anyone who is anyone in the glittering world of the Renaissance elite. But Italy is not the whole world. For the fork to become a truly European phenomenon, it needs to emigrate. It needs a champion, a well-connected influencer to introduce it to the other great courts of the continent. That champion will be a young, intelligent, and immensely powerful woman, Catherine de' Medici. Let's travel forward a few years to 1533. You are now part of the vast entourage of Catherine, a teenage heiress from the fabulously wealthy and powerful Florentine banking family. She is on her way to France to marry the man who will one day be King Henry II. This is a huge deal. It's a marriage of immense political and financial significance. And Catherine, being a Medici, does not travel light. She brings with her an army of attendants, financiers, artists, and, most importantly for our story, chefs. Her baggage train is legendary, loaded not just with her lavish wardrobe and jewels, but with the culinary treasures of Italy. She is bringing artichokes, broccoli, and ice cream to the French, things they have never seen before, and nestled carefully in velvet-lined cases. She is bringing her personal collection of dining forks. You arrive at the French court. It's a very different world from Florence. The French court is grand, martial, and in some ways, a little behind the times when it comes to table manners. They are still firmly in the knife and fingers camp. They view Italian refinement with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. It's seen as a bit too theatrical, a bit too tricky for their more straightforward, Gallic sensibilities. The wedding feasts are spectacular, a collision of French and Italian culinary traditions, and it is here that Catherine and her retinue deploy their secret weapon. As the elaborate courses are served, the French nobles watch, dumbfounded, as the Italian party calmly uses their little to minus pronged forks. They use them for the messy dishes, for the roasted meats, for the sweet pastries. They perform the elegance which they handle the tools with a silent, practiced grace. The initial French reaction is what you might expect, a combination of ridicule and bewilderment. They see it as a ridiculous affectation. Why would you need this silly little implement when you have a perfectly good knife and a sturdy set of fingers? It's another example of that over minus the minused up Italian flair. There are jokes and snide remarks. But Catherine is not some random visiting princess. She is about to be the queen. She is the center of a new, powerful circle at court. Her style, her tastes, her habits are suddenly the most fashionable things in the kingdom. and she persists. She and her Italian followers continue to use their forks at every meal. Day after day, they are not just eating, they are giving a master class in a new kind of civilization. This is a classic historians are still arguing moment. For a long time, the popular story was that Catherine de' Medici single-handedly introduced the fork to France, and by extension, to the rest of Europe. It's a great story, one powerful woman changing the continent's stable manners forever. However, more recent scholarship has complicated this narrative. Some historians have found evidence of forks existing in France in very small numbers, even before Catherine's arrival, likely brought back by nobles who had fought in the Italian wars. They argue that Catherine's role wasn't as an introducer, but as a popularizer. She didn't bring the first fork, but she made the fork famous. She made it cool. Her influence turned a rare curiosity into a desirable status symbol. Here's a great little detail to illustrate the point. The French word for fork is forkte, a diminutive of fork, meaning pitchfork. Just like in Italy, the name itself carried those rustic, agricultural connotations. But as Catherine's court became the epicenter of style, the forkte began to shed its old meaning and take on a new one: elegance, power, and proximity to the queen. You, as a member of her entourage, are on the front lines of this cultural mission. You eat with your fork, enduring the initial mockery, knowing that you are an ambassador for a more refined way of life. And slowly, you see the change happen. A young, ambitious French duke, hoping to win favor with the new dauphin, appears at dinner one night with a fork of his own, using it with studied, if slightly clumsy, concentration. Then a countess does the same. It starts as a way to curry favor with the powerful Italian clique, but it gradually becomes a desirable habit in its own right. Catherine's influence solidifies the fork's status as an indispensable tool of the aristocracy. She takes it from being a quirky Italian habit to an non-negotiable part of a royal place setting. The lesson is clear: if you want to be part of the inner circle, if you want to be considered truly fashionable and powerful, you eat like the queen, and the queen eats with a fork. The little utensil has successfully hitched a ride on a royal marriage, and in doing so, has taken its first great leap toward conquering the world. Thanks to Catherine's royal endorsement, the fork is now firmly established in the French court, and from there, its influence begins to trickle out across Europe. But as it spreads, something interesting happens. The fork's primary function starts to shift. It's no longer just about the practicalities of eating sticky food or keeping your hands clean. It is now becoming a tool for social competition. The fork has become an instrument in the art of one-upmanship. You are at a Parisian dinner party, a generation after Catherine's arrival. The use of a fork is no longer a shocking novelty. It's expected in polite society, but how you use your fork, and indeed, what kind of fork you use, has become a complex and ruthless game. The goal is no longer just to use the fork, but to use it with a level of skill and nonchalance that telegraphs your superior breeding. It's as P or as it, you are A on steroids. You watch a nobleman across the table. He's a master. His movements are so fluid, so economical, that he seems to be thinking about anything but the mechanics of eating. He's telling an amusing anecdote, gesturing with his free hand, all while perfectly cutting and lifting his food without a single misplaced motion or sound. He is broadcasting his effortless superiority. His fork minus work is a performance designed to make you, the less minus practiced diner, feel clumsy and self-minus conscious by comparison. Then you look down at his fork, while yours is a standard, if elegant, silver one. His is a masterpiece. The handle is carved from a single piece of flawless rock crystal. The tines are gilded silver. It's a piece of jewelry that just happens to be functional. This is the next level of the game for connoisseurship. People begin to commission custom made forks from the finest craftsmen. They have forks with handles of ivory, agate, lapis lazuli, or exotic woods from the New World. They have them engraved with their family crest, A particularly ostentatious host might provide his guests with a matched set of these astonishingly expensive forks. A casual display of wealth, so overwhelming it borders on aggression. The fork has become a canvas for conspicuous consumption. A particularly fascinating and slightly absurd trend that emerges is the traveling set. A wealthy nobleman or merchant wouldn't dream of being caught at an inn or a lesser nobleman's house without his proper tools. So, he carries with him a personal, portable dining set called a cadenas. This is all luxurious, often leather-bound case containing a matching knife, spoon, and, of course, a fork, all exquisitely crafted. When he sits down to eat, he opens his case with a flourish, a gesture that says, "I bring my own civilization with me. I do not trust the standards of others." It's the ultimate foodie power move. But the performance art of the fork goes beyond just skill and materials. It extends to a whole new set of ridiculously specific rules. You learn, for example, that it is considered gauche to use your fork to simply transport a pile of food to your mouth. Each bite should be a single, distinct morsel, elegantly speared. To load up your fork with a jumble of meat and vegetables is to betray a gluttonous and undisciplined nature. Here's a fantastic cold-knowledge tidbit from this era of hypermine etiquette: the resting position. When you paused in your meal to speak or take a drink, what did you do with your utensils? You couldn't just drop them on the table. The rules became incredibly precise. In some circles, the correct protocol was to lay the knife and fork parallel to each other across the top of your plate. In others, they were to be crossed in a specific way, and the orientation of the tines up or down could signify whether you were finished with your course or merely resting. Getting this wrong was a subtle but clear sign that you didn't belong. It was a secret code, and if you didn't know it, you were instantly marked as an outsider. Historians are still debating the social function of these increasingly complex rules. Were they genuinely about promoting a more pleasant and orderly dining experience? Or were they, as the sociologist Norbert Elias famously argued, primarily distinction rituals? Elias's theory is that the upper classes constantly invent new and more complex rules of etiquette as a way to defend their status. As soon as the middle class learns the old rules, like simply using a fork, the upper class has to invent new, more difficult ones like the correct resting position to keep themselves separate and superior. It's a never-mind-ascending cycle of social climbing and gatekeeping. So you find yourself in this high-minus-stakes game. You practice your fork skills in private, hoping to achieve that air of nonchalant mastery. You eye your neighbor's fork with a mixture of envy and admiration. You desperately try to remember the correct way to cross your utensils when the host asks you a question. Eating is no longer a simple act of sustenance. It is a performance, a competition, and a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. The fork, the little tool that was meant to make things cleaner, has made everything infinitely more complicated. The social pressure is immense. The rules are getting more and more complicated, and they seem to change depending on whose house you're dining in. A new market has just been born, the market for anxiety relief, and the product being sold is the etiquette manual. You're walking through the bustling streets of Paris or Venice, and you see a bookseller's stall. Amidst the religious texts and poetry collections, you spot a new genre of book, small, portable, and with a tantalizing title like The Rules of Refined Conduct or A Guide to Civil Conversation. These are the first mass-market etiquette books, and they are flying off the shelves. They are the 16th century equivalent of a viral life-hack video. You buy one, at home, by candlelight. You eagerly flip through the pages. It feels a bit like cheating, like you're getting a secret instruction manual for a game everyone else seems to know how to play. The authors of these books are the self-proclaimed etiquette gurus of their day. Men like the aforementioned Giovanni della Casa with his Galateo, or Stefano G. was with his civil conversation. They are the arbiters of taste, and they have an opinion on everything. A significant portion of the book is dedicated to the table, and specifically to the new challenges posed by the fork. The author breaks it down for you, step by painstaking step. He tells you to hold the fork in your left hand when cutting, as if holding a pen, a wonderfully evocative instruction. He describes in detail the switch maneuver, confirming that this is, for now, the most proper and accepted method. He warns you, in no uncertain terms, against the barbaric habit of eating with your left hand. The book is filled with wonderfully specific and sometimes bizarre prohibitions. It tells you, do not use your fork to gesture while you speak, for you might put out your neighbor's eye. A fair point. It instructs, do not use your fork to scratch an itch on your head. No matter how pressing, you get a whole chapter on noise, reinforcing the horror of the metal -un- ceramic scrape. The author advises you to think of your platter as a silent stage upon which your food performs. One of my favorite pieces of advice from these early manuals is about pacing. The author warns you not to eat too fast, as this is a sign of gluttony, nor to eat too slow, as this suggests you are bored or displeased with the food. You must eat at the correct tempo, a rhythm that is in harmony with your host and the other guests. It's like a form of social camouflage. Your fork becomes a conductor's baton, keeping you in time with the rest of the orchestra. But here's the problem. You buy another etiquette book, written by a different expert, and you discover that some of the rules are slightly different. One author insists the tines of the resting fork should point down. Another is adamant they should point up. One says it's acceptable to use a fork for certain stewed fruits. Another declares that only a spoon will do. The experts don't always agree. This is a point that historians who study these texts love to emphasize. We often think of etiquette as a single, monolithic set of rules, but in this early, formative period, it was a chaotic and contested field. These authors were not simply recording existing customs. They were actively trying to create them. They were entrepreneurs of etiquette, each trying to establish their own system as the dominant one. They were competitors, and their books were their manifestos. The academic debate continues, were these authors influential tastemakers who genuinely shaped behavior, or were they just savvy marketers who cashed in on existing social anxieties without having much real impact? The existence of these books tells us something crucial about the society of the time. It shows a growing literacy among the middle and upper classes, and a new faith in the power of the printed word to solve social problems. People believed they could learn to be refined. Gentility was no longer something you had to be born with. It was a skill you could acquire, a text you could study. This was a revolutionary idea. So use it with your little book, trying to memorize the rules, highlighting the contradictions. The manual is both a comfort and a curse. It gives you a framework, a set of guidelines that make you feel more confident. But it also introduces a new kind of anxiety, the fear of having studied the wrong text. You walk into a dinner party armed with the wisdom of Guru A, only to find that your host is a strict follower of Guru B. The fork was supposed to simplify life, but now you need to read a book just to figure out how to use it without making a fool of yourself. The age of anxiety is now in print. Armed with your etiquette manual and your hard -1 fork skills, you start to feel a glimmer of confidence. You can handle a roast. You can manage a tart. You can place your utensils down in a reasonably correct resting position. You think you've cracked the code. Then, the next course arrives, a simple basket of freshly baked bread. You confidently reach for your fork, intending to spear a small piece and place it on your trencher. The gentleman next to you, a seasoned courtier, gently but firmly places his hand on your arm. "My friend," he says, his voice a low whisper, "we do not do that. You have just stumbled upon one of the most baffling and counterintuitive aspects of fork etiquette, the list of forbidden foods." You quickly learn that the fork, for all its supposed civility, is not a universal tool. There is a whole category of foods that are considered deeply improper, even vulgar, to eat with a fork, and at the very top of that list is bread. Bread is special. It has powerful religious and symbolic connotations. It's the staff of life, the body of Christ in the Eucharist. To pierce this sacred food with a sharp, metal, artificial implement like a fork is seen as a profound sign of disrespect. Bread is to be broken with the hands, and only with the hands. This is a rule that transcends etiquette and enters the realm of sacrilege. To fork your bread is to commit a social and spiritual blunder of the highest order. Okay, you think, no bread, less unlearned. Then comes a platter of beautiful, ripe peaches and figs. They look soft, juicy, and messy, the perfect candidates for a fork. You reach again. Again, the gentle correction. Certain fruits, especially those with a peel or a skin that can be easily handled, are finger foods. The proper way to eat a peach is to hold it in your hand and eat it directly, or perhaps slice it with your knife. To use a fork on it is seen as overly fastidious, a ridiculous affectation. It implies you are so delicate that you can't even handle a piece of fruit. The list goes on, and it often seems completely arbitrary. Cheese, usually eaten with the tip of a knife. Oysters, in their shells, you eat them with your hands. Small roasted birds like ortolan, eaten with the hands, sometimes with the diner covering their head with a large napkin to hide their messy and, some say, shameful gluttony. This forbidden list is a fascinating puzzle for food historians. Why these specific foods? The no minus forking minus bread rule is clearly rooted in religious symbolism. But what about the others? The most compelling theory is that this is another form of social gatekeeping. The rules are intentionally counterintuitive. They are designed to trip up the newcomer, the nouveau rich social climber who has read the etiquette books and thinks they know everything. Imagine the scene: a wealthy merchant, trying to impress a table of old minus money aristocrats, diligently uses his fork for everything. Believing this is the pinnacle of refinement, he forks his bread, he forks his peach. The aristocrats watch in silent, smug amusement. His perfect etiquette is, to them, the clearest possible sign that he is an outsider. He knows the basic rule: use a fork, but doesn't understand the subtle, unwritten exceptions. The exceptions are the real test. They separate the people who were born into this world from those who are just visiting. Here we have one of the most peculiar cold knowledge items of fork history, the case of the artichoke. Catherine de' Medici was said to have adored artichokes, and she brought them to France. How were they eaten? With the hands. You peel off the leaves one by one, dip them in sauce, and scrape the flesh off with your teeth. The fork is useless. This is a perfect example of a high minus status. Messy food that completely bypasses the new rules of fork minus based cleanliness. Its difficulty is part of its appeal, a test of your dexterity and social confidence. The existence of this forbidden list shows that the rise of the fork wasn't a simple, linear progression toward total utensil minus based dining. It was a complex negotiation. The fork had to find its place alongside older, deeply ingrained traditions of eating with the hands and the knife. It wasn't a replacement. It was an addition to an already complex system. So use it there. You're fork resting on the table, feeling more confused than ever. The rules are a labyrinth of permissions and prohibitions. You need a fork for pasta, but not for peaches, for roasted meat, but not for bread, for a sticky tart, but not for an oyster. The simple act of eating has been transformed into a constant, nerve-minus-racking quiz. And the final, most maddening part, the most sophisticated people, the true masters of the game, are the ones who know exactly when to put their forks down and just use their hands. You've spent the evening wrestling with this awkward, two-minus-sprunged monster. You've been mocked for using it, stressed about which hand to use, shamed for the noise you made, and confused by the list of foods it's forbidden to touch. As you chase a stubborn pea around your plate, a simple, desperate thought might cross your mind: couldn't this thing be designed better? You are not alone in this thought. While the social battles over the fork were aging, a quieter, slower revolution was happening in the workshops of the artisans and silversmiths who actually made the things. They, too, were grappling with the fork's obvious design flaws. The evolution from art to mine has sprung Shunqi to the modern. Functional fork is a story of gradual, incremental innovation. For a very long time, the dominant design remains the two-pronged spear. It's simple to forge, and it aligns with the primary mental model of the fork as a piercing tool. But slowly, tentatively, a third tine appears. You start to see three as pronged forks emerging, particularly in Italy. In the 17th century, why three tines? The addition of a central prong offers a few key advantages. First, it provides more stability. It's slightly better at holding food without it wobbling off. More importantly, the two gaps between the three tines are smaller than the one large gap between two tines. This makes it marginally, and I mean marginally better at holding softer or smaller food items. You might actually be able to balance a few of those chickpeas now, instead of just pushing them around. But the real breakthrough, the change that would transform the fork from a spear into a shovel, is the curve. At some point, some brilliant, unsung hero of a blacksmith or silversmith decided to heat the tines and bend them into a gentle, upward curve. This is the fork's aha moment. Suddenly, the fork can do more than just stab. With the curve, it can now scoop. It can function as a sort of leaky spoon. You can use it to gather up rice, or polenta, or that mess of stewed vegetables. The curve creates a shallow bowl, turning the fork into a much more versatile, multi-purpose tool. It solves the great useless fork problem that plagued you earlier. The addition of the curve then enables the next logical step a fourth tine. With a curved head, you can now place the tines much closer together without them looking like a clump. The 4-tined, curved fork appears, most likely in France or England around the turn of the 18th century. And this is, essentially, the modern fork we know today. The 4 tines, set close together on a curved head, create a perfect balance. It can still pierce food effectively, but it can also hold and scoop loose items. It's the ultimate hybrid tool, the perfect synthesis of spear and spoon. This design evolution is a subject of ongoing academic fascination. Was it driven by consumer demand, with diners clamoring for a more functional tool? Or was it driven by the craftsmen themselves, experimenting and competing to create a superior product? The historical record is sparse on this point, but it was likely a feedback loop. A craftsman makes a slightly better, curved, 3-tined fork. A wealthy patron buys it and shows it off. Their guests see how much better it works and then go to their own silversmiths and say, "I want one of those new curved ones." Technology and social desire push each other forward. Here's a fantastic little detail for you: early fork tines were often left round in cross section, like little spikes. The process of flattening the tines into the blade-like shape we know today was another key innovation. Flattened tines were stronger, and their edges could even be used to cut soft foods like a piece of fish or a cooked vegetable, reducing the reliance on the knife. So, over the course of more than a century, you watch the tool in your hand slowly morph. The clunky, straight, two-pronged weapon gradually transforms. The tines multiply. They bend into a graceful curve. They flatten and become more refined. Each small change makes it a little easier, a little more intuitive, a little less stressful to use. The social and the technological are locked in a dance. The initial social desire for cleanliness and refinement creates a market for the fork. The practical failures of the early design create social awkwardness and a demand for a better tool. The technological innovations of the craftsman create a more functional fork, which in turn makes it easier for more people to adopt, reinforcing its social dominance. By the time you reach the end of this long evolutionary road, the fork in your hand feels completely different. It's no longer a strange, alien object. It feels balanced, functional, even friendly. It's a mature technology. The awkward teenage years are over. The fork is finally grown up. While the fork is busy evolving and embedding itself into the high society of Italy and France. Let's hop across the English Channel and see how our British friends are getting on. To put it mildly, they are not impressed. For the better part of 2 centuries, the English look at the fork with a unique brand of deep, unwavering suspicion and contempt. You are now an English nobleman in the early 17th century. You've just returned from a grand tour of the continent, a trip meant to round out your education. In Venice, you saw men eating with forks and found it rather curious. You even bought one, a small silver novelty, and brought it home in your luggage. At your next dinner party in London, you decide to show it off. The reaction is not the intrigued admiration you might have seen in France. It's open mockery. Your friends laugh at you. They call the fork an Italian whim minus wham. They accuse you of putting on airs. But the most common and most cutting insult is that the fork is effeminate. This is the central English objection, and it sticks around for an incredibly long time. The idea that using a fork is unmanly becomes a cornerstone of English cultural identity. A real Englishman, a John Bull type, eats with his knife and his fingers. He is straightforward, no Midas nonsense, and unashamed of his hearty appetite. He doesn't need some dainty, foreign contraption to convey food to his mouth. The fork is for Italians, with their elaborate manners, their decadent lifestyles, and their questionable morals. It's for the French, with their foppish fashions and their overly complicated sauces. It is, in short, profoundly un-minus English. The man we met earlier, Thomas Scoriat, is the perfect case study. In 1611, he published a book about his travels called Coriat's Gratuities. He devotes a whole section to his discovery of the Italian fork and passionately advocates for its adoption in England. He explains its hygienic benefits, its elegance. He is, essentially, England's first fork evangelist, and for his troubles, he is ridiculed for the rest of his life. He becomes a running joke in London society. Plays are written mocking him. His friends playfully call him for CIFer. His attempt to import this piece of continental sophistication is a spectacular failure. Why such a stubborn resistance? This is a question that fascinates historians of Anglo-minus European relations. Part of it is simple island conservatism, a general suspicion of foreign habits. But it's also tied up with major historical events. The English Reformation has created a deep religious and cultural rift with Catholic Southern Europe. Italy, as the seat of the Pope, is viewed with particular hostility. Adopting an Italian custom, like the fork, is seen by some as a small but significant act of cultural capitulation to a rival power. The fork isn't just a fork. It's a symbol of a whole cultural package that many English Protestants want nothing to do with. Here's a wonderful, quirky piece of evidence for this resistance. For a long time, the only forks you really find in England are not for eating meat, but are very long Midas-handled forks used for serving, or for plucking sweetmeats out of a communal pot. They are tools for the kitchen or the sideboard, not for the personal place setting. The idea of an individual dining fork is what they find so objectionable. It's not until the late 17th and early 18th century that the tide slowly begins to turn. The restoration of the monarchy brings back a king, Charles II, who has spent years in exile in France. He and his courtiers return with a taste for French fashion, French food, and, yes, French table manners. The fork finally gets its royal seal of approval in England. But even then, its adoption is slow and grudging. For decades, it remains a feature of the ultra-minus fashionable, London-minus based aristocracy. In the countryside, among the gentry, the old ways persist. There are still sermons being preached against the fork well into the 18th century. One famous naval instruction manual from the mid-minus 1700 seconds explicitly tells its young officers to eat with their fingers, as using a fork is a sign of dandyism unbecoming of a future naval hero. The historical debate here isn't about if the English resisted the fork. They clearly did, but why their resistance was so much more prolonged and vitriolic than that of the French. Was it pure anti-Catholic, anti-Italian sentiment? Was it a more deeply rooted concept of masculinity? Or was it just that Thomas Scory was a particularly uncool and unpersuasive influencer? The consensus is that it was a potent cocktail of all three. So, for nearly 200 years, the fork exists in a state of cultural limbo in England. It's known, it's available, but it is actively rejected by the mainstream. To use one is to make a bold, and often unwelcome, statement about your allegiances. It's a testament to the power of cultural identity, a reminder that the adoption of a new technology is never just about its practical benefits. Sometimes, it's about what it means to be English. As the fork slowly, painstakingly, wins its battles for acceptance across Europe, its influence begins to extend beyond just keeping your fingers clean or showing off your refined manners. The fork is quietly helping to reshape the very way people experience a meal, and by extension, how they relate to each other. It is an unwitting catalyst in the birth of a concept we now take for granted: personal space. Let's go back for a moment to the pre-fork world. You are at a banquet, sharing a central serving platter with 4 or 5 other people. You are all reaching into the same bowl, taking food from the same source. You might be using a communal salt cellar. You might even be sharing a drinking goblet with your neighbor. Dining is an intensely communal, physically intertwined experience. There is a wee-ness to the meal. Your space is their space. Now, introduce the fork, and the whole dynamic begins to shift. The first, most obvious change is the slow death of the communal platter. The fork, especially when paired with the knife in the left-hand, right-hand system, encourages a new level of precision and control. It makes it much easier to manage your own food on your own surface. This helps to popularize the use of the individual plate. Instead of a shared platter in the center, a servant now places a plate in front of you, and portions are served directly onto it. Suddenly, you have a territory. This round ceramic space is yours and yours alone. Your food is on it. You are no longer foraging from a common resource pool. The act of eating becomes more individualized. You are in charge of your own little culinary kingdom. The fork accelerates this process because you can now immediately cut, spear, and lift food from your own plate. There's less need to ever reach into the center of the table. Your dining radius shrinks. You stay within your own zone. The subtle, physical dance of negotiating the shared platter with your neighbors disappears, replaced by a more static, self-contained set of movements. This leads to a new conception of hygiene. The old system, with its hand-washing rituals, was about keeping your hands clean before they entered the communal space. The new system is about keeping the communal space out of your space. The fork acts as a barrier, a tool that mediates between you and the food, and by extension, between you and everyone else. It's a small, metal fence. This brings us to a fascinating, and still debated, theory from the sociologist Norbert Elias, whom we met earlier. He argued that this whole process, the rise of the fork, the individual plate, the increasingly complex rules of etiquette, was part of what he called the civilizing process. His idea is that over several centuries, European society saw a gradual increase in the threshold of embarrassment and shame. People became more sensitive to bodily functions, more aware of the invisible boundaries between individuals. The fork, in his view, is a perfect symbol of this. It pushes the act of eating further away from the body. You no longer touch your food with your hands. You use an intermediary. It's a step towards a more detached, civilized, and individualized way of being. Not all historians agree with Elias's grand theory. Some argue he overstates the case, pointing out that many communal dining practices continued for centuries. They suggest that the shift was driven more by practical changes in household management and technology than by a deep psychological shift in the European mindset. Did the fork create a desire for personal space, or did a growing desire for personal space create a need for the fork? It's a classic chicken minus or minus egg historical problem. Here's a wonderful, concrete example of this change: the fork killed the trencher. Remember that slice of stale bread that acted as a plate? For centuries, it was the standard. You put your food on it, the juices soaked in, and at the end of the meal, you might eat it, or, more commonly, give it to the poor or to the dogs. With the rise of the fork into permanent, reusable ceramic or pewter plate, the trencher became obsolete. This is a small change, but a profound one. It marks a shift from a disposable, communal mindset to a permanent, individual one. So, as you sit at your place setting, with your own plate, your own napkin, and your own set of utensils, you are experiencing the culmination of this long, slow separation. The space around you is more clearly defined. The meal is less about sharing a common pot and more about managing your own private portion. The fork didn't do this all on its own. Of course, it was part of a larger constellation of changes, but it was a key player, a tool that made this new arrangement possible. A small, pointy instrument that helped to draw the invisible lines that now separate us at the dinner table. By now, the fork has become a standard feature of any respectable dinner table in Western Europe. The basic questions of if and how to use it have been more or less settled. A new, more subtle language begins to develop around the fork, a language not of etiquette, but of economics. The fork in your hand is no longer just a tool for eating. It's a price tag. The material it's made from is a direct and unambiguous statement about your wealth and social standing. Let's say you're a person of modest means in the 18th century, a clerk, a skilled artisan, or a minor shopkeeper. You've finally saved up enough to buy a set of forks for your family. To show that you are keeping up with the times, your forks will be made of iron or perhaps steel. They are functional, sturdy, and probably have a simple handle of bone or wood. They do the job. But at a dinner party, the moment you set them on the table, they announce your status. They say, I am respectable, but I am not rich. Now, imagine you are a member of the burgeoning middle class, a successful merchant, a lawyer, or a doctor. Your forks are a step up. They might be made of pewter, the softer, grayish metal that mimics the look of silver without the exorbitant cost. Or, you might have forks that are silver minus plated, a major technological breakthrough in the 1740s. Sheffield plate allowed craftsmen to fuse a thin layer of silver onto a base of copper. This created utensils that looked and felt like solid silver, but were more affordable. Your Sheffield plate forks are a symbol of your aspiration. They say, I have taste and ambition. I am on my way up. Finally, picture yourself at the apex of society. You are a duke, an earl, a prince of the church. Your forks are not plated. They are solid, heavy, gleaming silver. The sheer weight of the utensil in your hand is a statement. Silver was the standard for wealth, the physical embodiment of money. To eat with it was the ultimate act of conspicuous consumption. It was like scooping up your peas with a pile of coins. Your silver forks would be exquisitely crafted by a famous silversmith, stamped with his maker's mark and a hallmark from the assay office, guaranteeing their purity. They would be part of a massive, matched set that includes dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces, all engraved with your family's coat of arms. The value of the silver in your dining service alone could be enough to buy a small country estate. When you host a dinner, the forks are not just for eating. They are part of the treasury, a display of the deep, immovable wealth of your lineage. Here's a fantastic little detail that illustrates this material hierarchy the number of times. For a long time, high Midas and custom minus made silver forks often stuck with the 3 tine design. It was seen as more elegant and aristocratic, a subtle nod to the older, more correct Italian style. The 4 tined fork, while more practical, was for a time associated with mass produced, lower minus grade utensils. So, a true connoisseur might be able to guess your social standing just by counting the prongs on your fork. This is one of those wonderfully snobbish details that the upper classes use to differentiate themselves. Historians who study material culture are fascinated by the inventories of great houses from this period. These documents list, in meticulous detail, every single object a family owned, and the dining silver always gets special attention. They list 6 dozen silver dinner forks, 4 dozen silver dessert forks, 2 dozen silver serving forks. These were not just household items, they were assets, part of the family's wealth portfolio, to be passed down through generations or, in times of war or crisis, melted down to pay for an army. The debate among historians here is about motivation. Was the obsession with silver forks driven primarily by the desire for a beautiful and functional dining tool? Or was it first and foremost a financial investment and a way to display raw economic power? The answer is that it was impossible to separate the two. The beauty and the value were one and the same. So, the fork, which began its life as a simple tool, has completed its transformation into a complex social signifier. It's a class password, written in metal. The material in your hand tells a story of iron mines, copper workshops, and silver vaults. It places you on a social ladder, from the simple sturdiness of steel to the aspirational gleam of Sheffield plate to the undeniable, authoritative weight of solid silver. Before you even take a bite, your fork has already told everyone at the table exactly who you are. While the glittering silver forks of the aristocracy were broadcasting wealth and status, the much grimmer, more powerful force was at play in the background, subtly reinforcing the case for the fork among all classes of society: the fear of disease. Let's step back into the mindset of someone living in a world without germ theory. You don't know about bacteria or viruses, but you do know about plagues, fluxes, and fevers. You know that sickness can spread through a community like wildfire, and you have a set of beliefs about how it travels. One of the most persistent ideas is the theory of miasma, the belief that disease is carried by bad air, foul smells, and general filth. Now, think about the traditional, communal way of eating. You're sharing a bowl with others. People are dipping their fingers, which may or may not be clean, into the shared food. The person next to you is coughing. The general level of hygiene, by our standards, is low. Even if you don't understand the precise mechanism of contagion, you have an intuitive, instinctual sense that this proximity, this sharing, is risky. The great waves of plague, like the Black Death in the 14th century and its subsequent outbreaks, left a deep and lasting psychological scar on European society. While the Black Death itself predates the fork's widespread adoption, the recurring epidemics that followed for centuries kept the fear of contagion alive. Every few decades, a new outbreak of plague or smallpox would remind people of their vulnerability. This is where the fork finds an unlikely ally. The fork is a tool of separation. As we've seen, it creates personal space. It acts as a barrier between your hand and your food, and between your food and everyone else's. In a world terrified of invisible sickness, this barrier function takes on a whole new importance. Using a fork isn't just about being elegant, it's about being safe. It's a small act of self-preservation. You can imagine a mother in the 17th century, having lived through an outbreak of the sweat or the flux, teaching her children to use a fork. Her motivation might be partly about social climbing, but it's also deeply practical. Don't put your fingers in the stew, she might say. Use your fork. You don't know where other hands have been. It's a folk understanding of hygiene, a piece of practical advice passed down through generations. Here we come to a major point of debate among medical historians and sociologists. How direct was the link between public health crises and the adoption of the fork? Was it a conscious choice, with people explicitly saying, we must use forks to prevent the spread of plague? Or was it a much more gradual, subconscious shift, the historical record rarely gives us such a clear smoking gun. You won't find many documents that say, a cholera outbreak in our town has convinced us all to purchase forks. Instead, historians argue that the link was more indirect. The constant threat of epidemics fostered a general, rising tide of what we might call hygienic anxiety. This anxiety made people more receptive to any new technology or custom that promised greater cleanliness and separation. The fork was a perfect fit. It rode a wave of public health fear that it didn't create, but from which it certainly benefited. It was the right tool at the right time. One of the most compelling pieces of circumstantial evidence is the change in attitudes toward sharing cups. For centuries, sharing a drinking vessel was common, but as concerns about contagion grew, the individual cup or goblet became a marker of a well-run, health-conscious household. The fork and the individual plate are part of this same cultural package. They are all pieces of a larger movement towards what we might call hygienic individualism. A quirky little side note is the role of syphilis. The Great Pox, as it was known, spread rapidly through Europe from the late 15th century onwards. Because it could cause sores in and around the mouth, there was a great deal of fear about transmission through shared utensils and cups. Some historians have argued that the fear of syphilis was a significant, if often unspoken, driver in the move towards personal tableware. So as you use your fork, you are participating in a ritual that is not just about social grace, but also about a deep-seated historical fear. The fork is a tiny shield. It's a product of an age that was learning, slowly and painfully, to be wary of its neighbors, to be suspicious of shared spaces, and to see the world as a place filled with invisible dangers. Your simple act of spearing a piece of meat is an echo of your ancestors' desperate attempts to keep death from the dinner table. The fork has now conquered the adult world, from the royal courts to the merchant's dining room. It has become an non-negotiable part of civilized life. The next logical step in ensuring its total domination is to start them young. The fork has now entered the nursery. Teaching a child how to use a fork properly becomes a crucial, and often frustrating, part of a respectable upbringing. You are now a parent in the 18th or 19th century. Your child has just graduated from eating with their hands and a spoon. It is time for them to learn the ways of the knife and fork. This is not just about teaching them a practical skill. It is one of their first and most important lessons in social conformity and class identity. The first challenge is purely physical. A child's small hands and developing motor skills are not well-suited to the task. The utensils are heavy, long, and require a grip that is not intuitive. You watch your son struggle. He holds the fork like a dagger, fist clenched around the handle. He tries to stab at a piece of potato, misses, and sends it skittering off the plate. He tries to scoop up some peas, and they cascade onto the tablecloth. It is a scene of pure chaos. Your job is to be patient but firm. You take his hand and try to reposition his fingers into the correct grip. Not like that, darling. Like this. Hold it as you would a quill. You demonstrate the pinning and cutting motion over and over again. You praise him for a successful, clean bite. You gently chide him when he reverts to using his fingers. This process is a microcosm of the era's philosophy of child-rearing. Childhood is not seen as a time of free-spirited play, but as a training ground for adulthood. The goal is to mold the child, to suppress their natural, animalistic impulses like eating with their hands and instill in them the discipline and self-control of a civilized adult. The daily fork and knife lesson is a battleground where this philosophy is put into practice. A fascinating little detail from this period is the creation of specialized children's cutlery. Silverstein began to produce miniature, scaled down sets of knives, forks, and spoons. These are not toys. They are serious tools, often made of solid silver and engraved with the child's initials or a sentimental inscription. A christening gift of a personal silver cutlery set becomes a popular tradition. This gift sends a powerful message: you are now part of a family, a class, and a culture that uses these tools. You are expected to learn their ways. The social stakes are incredibly high. A child who can't use a knife and fork properly is a source of immense embarrassment to their parents. It reflects badly on the entire family. It suggests a lack of discipline, a poor upbringing. When you have guests for dinner, your child's table manners are on full public display. Their performance is a direct reflection of your success or failure as a parent. The pressure on the child to get it right is intense. Historians who study the history of childhood see this moment as highly significant. The insistence on complex utensil use at a young age is part of a broader trend of introducing adult social norms into the lives of children much earlier. The etiquette manuals of the time start to include chapters specifically addressed to young people, warning them against slurping their soup, speaking with their mouths full, and, of course, holding their fork like a savage. The debate among these historians is about the psychological impact. Did this rigorous, early training instill a valuable sense of discipline and social grace? Or did it create a generation of people with a deep-seated anxiety about food and social performance? It's impossible to know for sure, but it's clear that the dinner table became an early arena for social conditioning. So you continue the lesson. Day after day, you clean up the spilled peas. You gently correct the grip. Then one day, something clicks. Your child cuts a piece of meat, spears it cleanly, and brings it to his mouth without incident. A wave of relief and pride washes over you. It's a small victory, but a significant one. He has passed a key milestone on the long road to becoming a gentleman. He has learned the language of the fork, a language that will open doors for him for the rest of his life. The little utensil has become a key, and you have just taught your child how to use it. The fork, now fully mature and integrated into European society, is about to make its most important journey yet across the Atlantic Ocean. As colonists from England, France, and other European nations establish new settlements in the Americas, they bring their cultural baggage with them, and nestled inside that baggage is the fork. You are now a colonist in 18th-century America. You might be in bustling Boston, sophisticated Philadelphia, or a rural plantation in Virginia. In the homes of the wealthy and the aspiring, the fork is a familiar sight. But it's here, in this new context, that something peculiar happens. The Americans take the established rules of fork etiquette and develop their own, unique, and, to European eyes, slightly baffling variation. Let's revisit the great hand debate we saw earlier. By this time, in fashionable European circles, the Euro method has largely won out. It's efficient and elegant to keep the fork in your left hand for eating. But the American colonists, primarily influenced by English customs from a slightly earlier, more formal period, cling stubbornly to the switch. And so, wishing you a pleasant experience. The American zig-zag method is born and codified. You are at a dinner in Philadelphia. You hold your fork in your left hand times down and your knife in your right. You pin your food. You cut a single bite of meat. Now, the zig-zag begins. You place your knife down on the upper right edge of your plate, blade facing inward. This is crucial, never just drop the knife. You then switch your fork from your left hand to your right. You turn the fork over, so the tines are now facing up. You spear the bite of meat and perhaps gather a few vegetables with it, and lift it to your mouth. Then, you place the fork back in your left hand, tines down, pick up your knife, and start the whole process over again. To an outsider, it looks incredibly inefficient and overwrought. A French visitor to America in the 19th century famously described it as watching a person constantly preparing to play the violin and then changing their mind. Why did this method become so entrenched in America? This is one of the great, ongoing debates in the history of manners. One theory is that it was a form of cultural fossilization. The English colonists brought with them the most formal, high-status etiquette of their time, which was the switch. In the relative isolation of the colonies, this habit became frozen in place, while back in Europe, manners continued to evolve towards the more practical left-handed method. America, in this view, is a kind of living museum of 18th century English formality. Another, more compelling theory is that it was a conscious choice, a way for the new nation to assert its own distinct identity. In the years following the American Revolution, there was a desire to be seen as a civilized and sophisticated nation, not a backwater full of rough frontiersmen. By adopting and rigidly adhering to this highly formal, if inefficient, style of eating, Americans were making a statement. They were signaling that they were just as refined, if not more so, than the Europeans they had just broken away from. The Zig-Zag was a small, daily declaration of cultural independence. Here's a fantastic little tidbit: this method also created a demand for a specific type of fork. The American fork often developed slightly thicker, more robust outer tines. Why? Because after you put your knife down, you often use the side of your fork to cut softer foods, like fish or cooked vegetables, a task for which a flimsy fork was ill-suited. The Zig-Zag method became a powerful social marker within the United States. To use it correctly was a sign of good breeding. To eat European style was often seen as lazy, or worse, as an affectation of a foreigner. Generations of American children were reeled in the Zig-Zag. Cut, tuck, switch, eat. It became as American as apple pie. So use it at your Philadelphia dinner table, carefully performing the Zig-Zag. Each movement is a testament to your place in this new society. You are not a European. You are not a rough-hewn pioneer. You are a civilized American, and you have the ridiculously complicated table manners to prove it. The fork, which once divided Italians by their piety and Englishmen by their manlines, is now helping to define what it means to be an American. Let's leave the New World and its Zig-Zagging ways for a moment and journey forward in time to the 19th century, to the undisputed capital of industrial and imperial power, Victorian England. Here, the fork doesn't just become a tool, it becomes an obsession. The Victorians take the fork and multiply it, creating a bewildering and anxiety-inducing arsenal of specialized utensils that represents the absolute zenith of fork-mania. You are at a grand dinner party in a London townhouse, sometime around 1880. The table is a dazzling, terrifying sight. At your place setting, you are confronted not with one fork, but with a whole phalanx of them. Arranged in a gleaming silver row, there's a massive dinner fork, a slightly smaller luncheon fork, and then the confusing array of other, more exotic creatures. You feel a wave of panic. Which one do you use for what? The Victorian era was a time of unprecedented wealth, industrial production, and a rigid, almost suffocating, social hierarchy. The newly rich industrialists and the established aristocracy were locked in a constant battle of social one-upmanship, and the dinner table was one of their primary battlefields. The way to prove your superior refinement was through hyper-specialization. The more obscure and specific your knowledge of social rules, the more well-spread you were. This led to an explosion of purpose-built forks. The rule was simple: if a food could conceivably have its own fork, it should. And so, the silver stimmus of Birmingham and London went into overdrive. You see an oyster fork, a tiny, three-pronged creature designed for plucking mollusks from their shells. There's a fish fork, often with a wide, slightly curved shape and a decorative motif, designed to be used with a special, non-cutting fish knife. Then there's the salad fork, a dessert fork, a fruit fork, a pastry fork, sometimes with one thickened, sharpened tine for cutting through crusts, a berry fork, an ice cream fork, a strange hybrid of a fork and a spoon, a sardine fork, a lettuce fork, even In the most ridiculously elaborate households, a terrapin fork for eating turtle. The sheer number of them is staggering. A full, formal dinner service from a top Victorian silversmith could contain dozens of different types of forks. And you, the diner, were expected to know which was which, and to use them in the correct order. The general rule was to work from the outside in, but even that could be confusing. God help you if you used your salad fork for the fish course. It was a social sin of the highest magnitude, a clear signal that you were not one of us. This is a point of great fascination for social historians. Why this mania for specialization? One theory is that it was a way of imposing order and scientific classification onto the chaos of life. The Victorians were obsessed with collecting, categorizing, and naming things, from beetles to ferns. They applied this same scientific, ordering impulse to the dinner table. Every food had its proper place, and every food had its proper tool. It was a way of making the act of eating rational and controlled. Another, more cynical theory is that it was simply a brilliant marketing strategy by the silverware manufacturers. By convincing society that a dozen different forks were a social necessity, they could sell vastly more silver, feeding the anxieties of the aspiring middle class who desperately wanted to emulate the aristocracy. The historical debate lies in whether the demand created the supply, or the supply cleverly created the demand. Here's a wonderfully absurd, cold knowledge tidbit from this era, the Great Asparagus Controversy. For a time, it was considered proper to eat asparagus with a special set of asparagus tongs, but some etiquette gurus declared this to be vulgar. They insisted that the only truly refined way to eat asparagus was with the fingers. This led to heated debates in the pages of ladies' magazines. Entire dinner parties could be ruined by an asparagus-related faux pas. It perfectly encapsulates the absurd, high-stakes nature of Victorian dining. So use it there, paralyzed by choice. The fish course is served. You take a breath, look at the array of forks, and make your best guess. You pick up the one you believe to be the fish fork. You glance at your hostess. She gives a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of approval. You have survived, but the meal is long, and there are many more forks to come. This is the ultimate destination of our long journey from a world with no forks. We have arrived in a world with too many of them. The anxiety has come full circle. The Victorian dining room, with its glittering arsenal of specialized forks, represents the peak of a certain kind of madness. It was the Forks Gilded Age period of astonishing complexity and crushing social pressure. From this summit of anxiety, the only way to go was down, towards a simpler, more rational approach to dining. Let's take a moment, a deep breath, and look back over our long journey, not at the path we took, but at the bizarre, overgrown, and thorny side trails we are thankfully no longer required to explore. Let's appreciate some of the forgotten rules of fork etiquette. First, let's pour one out for the forbidden foods list. Can you imagine the mental gymnastics required? You'd have to remember that your fork, the very symbol of refinement, was considered a vulgar weapon against the sacred body of a bread roll. You'd have to recall that a juicy peach was to be tackled by hand, while a syrupy one demanded a fork. It's a set of rules so counterintuitive it feels designed to make you fail. We can be grateful that today, the decision to fork a piece of bread is a matter of personal preference, not a theological crisis. Then there was the acoustic minefield. You no longer have to live in mortal fear of the screech of metal on ceramic. That sound, which to our ears is a minor annoyance, was once the audible confession of your social failure. The demand for silent, graceful eating created a level of tension that would be comical if it weren't so real. Imagine trying to carry on a witty conversation while simultaneously ensuring your fork never made contact with your plate at the wrong angle or with the wrong pressure. It's exhausting just to think about. And what about the sheer physical labor of early forks? We can be thankful we are no longer bound by the tyrannical switch oars egg-tag maneuver unless you are a staunch American traditionalist. Of course, the laborious process of cutting, parking the knife, switching the fork to the right hand, eating, and then switching back, was a marathon of micro-minus movements performed for every single bite of meat. It was a system born from a deep-minus-seated taboo against the left hand, a taboo we have largely, and logically, abandoned in favor of efficiency. My personal favorite forgotten rule is the secret language of resting utensils. Today, if you pause during a meal, you can place your fork and knife on your plate however you like. But for centuries, the placement was a code. Tines up or down, crossed or parallel, each position sent a specific signal. I am merely resting. I am finished with this course. I did not enjoy this meal, the particularly risky one. It was a silent, passive-aggressive conversation happening on the surface of your plate. Getting it wrong could inadvertently insult your host or cause a servant to whisk away your plate before you were finished. Historians still debate how strictly these intricate rules were ever enforced in reality. Were they the iron-clad laws of society, where a single misstep could lead to social ruin? Or were they more like the hyper-idealized images we see on social media today? A standard that existed primarily in etiquette books to torment the insecure. While in practice, most people were a bit more relaxed. The consensus leans towards the latter, but the anxiety, for those who cared, was very real. And we can't forget the absurd pinnacle of Victorian specialization. We are lucky to live in a world where you do not need to know the difference between a sardine fork and a pastry fork. The idea that a single food, like the terrapin or the oyster, required its own unique, specially minus-shaped tool, is a testament to an age that had, perhaps, a little too much time and money on its hands. We have shed this mountain of silver, this heavy burden of knowledge, and returned to a kind of elegant simplicity. One fork, maybe two, is all you need. Looking back, the history of the fork is a history of solutions that create new problems. The fork solved the problem of sticky fingers, but it created the problem of noise. It solved the problem of sharing bowls, but it created the problem of which hand to use. It solved the problem of spearing meat, but it created the problem of what to do with peas. For every step towards convenience, it seems, there was a new, elaborate rule designed to make life more difficult. We have, thankfully, inherited the solution but forgotten most of the problems. So after all that madness, all the anxiety, the social climbing, and the ridiculous rules, here you are, back in your own time. Take up a fork, not a hypothetical renaissance fork or a ridiculously specific Victorian one, but your own, everyday fork. Look at it, really look at it for a moment. That simple object you've used thousands of times without a second thought is a piece of living history. It's a museum you can eat with. Notice its features, forged not just in steel, but in centuries of human drama. Look at the tines. There are probably 4 of them. Those 4 prongs are the descendants of that brutish, two-minus-pronged spear that so scandalized the Venetians. The journey from 2 tines to 4 is a story of countless failed attempts to eat soft food, and a slow, hard -1 battle for practicality over tradition. Each additional tine is a quiet monument to someone, somewhere, who thought, there has to be a better way to eat these peas. Now, notice the gentle, upward curve of the head. That curve is the fork's salvation. It marks the moment the fork transcended its violent, sparing origins and learned to be gentle, to scoop, to carry. That curve is the solution to the sticky dessert problem, the answer to the polenta puzzle. It's the feature that turned the fork from a niche, high-maintenance accessory into the versatile workhorse of the dinner table. Consider the metal itself. It's likely stainless steel. This, in its own way, is the final chapter of the fork's social journey. Stainless steel, an invention of the early 20th century, is the great democratizer. It ended the class war being fought on the dinner table. It doesn't have the aristocratic gleam of solid silver, nor the aspirational pretense of Sheffield plate, nor the humble utility of iron. It is classless. It is durable, affordable, and hygienic. Your stainless minus steel fork is a symbol of a world where refinement is no longer the exclusive property of the rich. Even the way you hold it tells a story. Do you keep it in your left hand to eat? Or do you perform the zig minus ag switch? That choice, that simple motor habit, is a living fossil of the great hand minus debate, a faint echo of the rivalry between European efficiency and American formality. The ultimate, and perhaps most bizarre, expression of the fork's long identity crisis is its strange modern cousin, the spork. This humble hybrid of spoon and fork, beloved of fast minus food restaurants and campers, is the logical, if slightly goofy, conclusion to the whole story. It finally answers the question that plagued our Renaissance ancestors: is it for spearing or for scooping? The spork's answer is a shrug and a simple yes. The grand historical debate that still simmers today is about the why. Why did the West, over several centuries, collectively decide to put this piece of metal between its fingers and its food? Was it truly, as Norbert Elias argued, part of a grand civilizing process, a top-minus-down movement driven by the elite's desire to distinguish themselves and control their animal impulses? Or was it a more bottom-minus-up phenomenon, driven by practical concerns like hygiene, the changing nature of food halal, sticky sugar and pasta, and the simple, human desire not to make a mess? The truth, as always, is likely a messy, complicated combination of it all. There is no single, simple answer. So the next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to appreciate the small, silent object in your hand. It is the product of religious fear, social anxiety, technological innovation, and naked ambition. It is a testament to our bizarre, contradictory, and unending quest to be civilized. Every bite you take is the final, peaceful chapter in a very, very long and awkward story. And so, the story of the fork comes to a gentle close. The journey is over. Let the sounds of the distant banquet hall fade away now, the murmur of hushed conversations, the faint clink of silver on ceramic, the sharp debates over etiquette. Let them all soften into a low, distant hum. They are just echoes now, whispers in a dream you are beginning to leave behind. There are no more rules to learn, no more social tests to pass. The anxieties of the past can dissolve, like sugar in warm water. All that's left is the quiet of your own room, the soft darkness behind your eyelids. Feel the gentle weight of the blanket, the steady, easy rhythm of your own breathing. The story has been told, and now the mind can rest. Let the little details, the 2- bronze spear, the Victorian sardine fork, the scandal of the left hand drift away like motes of dust in a fading sunbeam. They can be found again tomorrow, if you wish. But for now, there is only this moment of peace, just the soft darkness, and the quiet rhythm of your own breath. The end of the article. Good night.